So in this section of the video, what we thought we'd do is actually walk you through our use of semantic technology. If you've watched some of the previous videos, you've heard some of our thinking about what this technology is, what it's powerful at accomplishing, a little bit about where it's not a great fit or maybe doesn't make a lot of sense to explore it. So we thought we'd show you where we've used it, a specific example of what led us to choose it, how we applied it, and the results of applying it. So that'll be our case study. This case study deals with a healthcare claims payer in the government space. It's a company that's contracted by CMS, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and they administer the Medicare fund, essentially. That fund has to, which goes out to the providers and is paid to the providers based for services. Actually, the CMS awards contracts to payers to actually take care of that part of the relationship, to actually pay the claims, work with the providers, and make sure that the system is working, that the appropriate claims are being paid, and the claims that should be denied are being denied. And so that is an interesting landscape. It's a very competitive landscape. They have to bid on these contracts that come up for renewal periodically. And it's also competitive because CMS has over time changed how they lay out or break up the country into what they call jurisdictions. And in the original map there, they had essentially 15 jurisdictions, and in fact, they would award Part A coverage separate from Part B. So you could easily have up to 30 companies administering this. And what they've been doing is trying to simplify that and reduce the number of companies involved, and so they've collapsed the number of jurisdictions and moved to a lettering system. And they've also started awarding the Part A and Part B as a unit. So now there are far fewer opportunities, and so it's become very competitive if you want to stay in that business. So we were brought in by one of these companies because they had to deal with a specific issue. So their challenge at this particular organization was that their medical review process was not performing particularly effectively. Medical review is interesting in that you have very knowledgeable workers, typically nurses, registered nurses, looking at medical records, figuring out whether or not a claim should be paid. Now, what's interesting is that's a very time-consuming process. It's time-consuming because you have to reach out to the provider, the doctor, the hospital, and say, please send all the records related to this claim. And then you have to go through those records and see if, in fact, there's evidence within there that the diagnosis is accurate, that the procedures that were carried out and billed for were appropriate. And this is very time-consuming. And so what you don't want to do as a payer organization is pay your nurses to review claims only to find out that, in fact, the claim should be paid. What you want to do is spend your time looking at claims where there's a problem, where something is miscoded, or the information in the medical record doesn't support the diagnosis or the procedures that were carried out. In other words, you want to find situations where the claim should be denied, because those are situations where the provider has potentially made mistakes, or there have been coding errors made as the claim data was actually entered, and that's what you want to identify. So in this case, at this payer, their denial rate was about 30% for reviewed claims. So their nurses were spending 70% of their time looking at all this information, and they were requesting all this information from the providers. And 70% of the time, everything was fine. And you really want it to be the other way around. You want to be denying 70% of the time or better. They also had an issue that they were slow to react to those outcomes. So when you do these medical reviews, you actually set up a filter in your claims system and say, claims that look like this, so whether it's based on provider or the type of service or the area of the country, or you put rules in place to say if the claim looks like this, then please put this claim into essentially appended status because we want to review it. And so you need to figure out what those rules are, and if you start to find as you do reviews that you're not finding claims to deny, you want to quickly stop pulling those types of claims, because apparently there's not a systemic issue to go after. And they were slow to be able to do that, so they were actually going a long time with these edits before they realized, oh, this edit isn't actually effective at finding claims to be denied. They also were suffering from repeated defects. So a lot of times what gets the glamour around medical review and claim denials is fraud. We talk about fraudulent providers or entities that set themselves up as providers and send in fictitious claims and try and bring in money. But a lot of cases, these claim errors are just that, they're mistakes. They could be mistakes made by the people who code the claim based on the medical record, or they could be mistakes made as the doctor or nurse was going through some process. But a lot of times they could be human error. They don't understand what they needed to document. They don't understand what tests they should have run. And what was happening was that this company would deny the claim and tell the provider, hey, this is inappropriate. But the provider would make this exact same mistake on the next claim they sent in. And so they were having a difficult time figuring out how do we stop these repeated defects. And then finally, they were struggling with how to make use of analytics. They had a lot of data, and in some cases they didn't have data, and they were having a difficult time collecting the data they needed and relating the data, etc. And so if you drill into the root causes behind why they're having these issues, it came down to this set of items. The first one is that when they decided what claims they wanted to pull, that was really a description in text. Somebody would write down, I want to look at claims that have this kind of information on them. And then different individuals would read that and have to go code those into a variety of systems, whether it's the claim payment system or the medical review system, etc. So now you had people interpreting this text and putting these definitions in these different systems. Well, those definitions didn't necessarily agree. So you had a problem with this kind of what we call manual copying. You were taking this information and putting it into each of those systems independently. So you didn't have a structured way to represent the edit definition itself. So that was number one. Another thing you had was a lack of agility around the information that the nurse actually placed in the system. So the nurse is going through the medical records and has to come to a conclusion as to whether or not this claim should be paid or denied. And what they did not have an easy way to do was to modify the interface that the nurse was using to record those decisions. So as the nurse says, oh, this is for a hip replacement, I should find an x-ray that shows X amount of bone damage. If I can't find that, they really needed a way in their system to be able to say, yes, the x-ray doesn't show the bone damage, something like that. But instead, the best they had in their system would be something like no medical necessity. And so they just had this lack of agility with those checklists. The review details related to that were not collected, so I didn't know why. The system didn't know why the nurse was saying this claim should be denied. And of course, that then led to the fact that the providers themselves were mystified when the rejection came in, because they would get a claim rejection that said no medical necessity. And they don't know what did I do incorrectly, right? They don't understand what the mistake is or how they should change their procedure. And then finally, there's multiple systems involved in all of this that have part of the story, but nobody has a unified view of it. So if you think about our discussion of semantics, that a lot of that is perfect for semantics. Semantics gets us the flexibility of our data model. And so this idea that I can be looking at different types of claims that deal with different situations, and I need those checklists to relate in different ways, semantics makes that straightforward. I also need the ability to aggregate data from these multiple systems. And again, semantics is all about that federation and integration with those legacy systems. And then that tie to the medical professional, to actually tie it to the educational material, to say, here's the mistake you made, and here's the instructions for the procedure you really need to go through if you're going to submit a claim for this kind of diagnosis. We can now tie that together using semantics, because it's relatively straightforward in our graph to take this piece of information over here, which might be the educational documentation for the provider, or the instructions essentially, and this fact over here that the nurse just asserted saying I'm denying it because the x-ray doesn't show something. And now I can build a triple that starts to tie that relationship together. So semantics made a lot of sense to us to apply to this, and so that's exactly what we did. And the outcome here was fantastic. We now had the ability to collect more detailed data, more granular data around the review process and outcome, which then allows us to do much more interesting analytics, some more data mining work, if you will. The ontology lets us deal with those risks and change the checklist and all the rest of it. The reasoner, which we hadn't talked about up to now in its use in this project, but the reasoner actually now allows us to have information in our ontology that talks about the claim data itself and whether or not there are relationships between the claim data itself and the types of denials that we're seeing, and can we do things to then help the nurse know where they should look first to potentially speed up the process. And then that flexible classification ontology allows us to deal with the different types of issues that we're running into and relate them. So again, very powerful use of the technology, and very successfully integrated. We didn't replace their systems. They still have the same claim payment system that they always had. They still go through a medical review process similar to the one they went through before, and in fact they still use very similar reporting system that they used out of that to understand how that medical review process is working and measure it and understand its metrics. But we've now got this new component that's able to federate and add agility around it that has improved the process significantly.